There's a patient intake form from 1867, Danvers State Hospital, Massachusetts. The handwriting is precise, bureaucratic, unnervingly calm. Name, Sarah Mitchell. Age 34. Occupation, former schoolteacher. Reason for commitment, persistent delusions regarding the alteration of city streets. Claims buildings have sunk. Insists windows now below ground were once at street level. Refuses correction despite repeated rational explanation. Sarah Mitchell wasn't violent. She hadn't harmed anyone. She wasn't hearing voices or seeing things that weren't there. Her crime was simpler, she remembered. She remembered when the ground floor entrance to Boston's old State House opened to the street, not to 6 feet of compacted earth. She remembered when Beacon Hill's basement windows let in sunlight, not darkness and soil. She remembered a different Boston, a lower Boston, a Boston before something happened that the official record refuses to name. And for that memory, she spent the rest of her life behind asylum walls. Now ask yourself this. Between 1840 and 1890, over 500 massive psychiatric institutions were constructed across Europe and North America. Enormous stone fortresses appearing almost simultaneously in cities and rural towns alike, built with impossible speed, filled with patients whose names appeared in admission logs but nowhere else in the historical record. What if they weren't hospitals at all? What if they were prisons for witnesses, for people who remembered what came before the reset? Let me show you something that doesn't make sense. In 1800, there were approximately 15 dedicated psychiatric institutions in all of the United States, purpose-built facilities designed specifically for the mentally ill. 15. By 1890, there were 327. That's not gradual growth, that's explosion. From 15 to 327 in 90 years, with the majority constructed in a single 40-year window between 1845 and 1885. Britain followed the same pattern. In 1800, roughly a dozen county asylums existed across England and Wales. By 1890, there were over 140. France went from handfuls to hundreds. Germany, Russia, Austria, Hungary, Italy. The pattern repeats with mechanical precision. And it wasn't just Europe and America. Argentina began constructing massive asylums in the 1850s. Australia built them in remote territories with populations barely large enough to support a general hospital. Japan, with no prior tradition of institutional psychiatry, suddenly adopted Western asylum architecture in the 1870s, all at once, all using remarkably similar designs, all filling immediately upon opening. The standard explanation is industrialization, urban crowding, the dissolution of traditional family structures, capitalism driving people mad. But here's the problem with that explanation. The asylum boom doesn't correlate with industrial centers. Rural Vermont built asylums as large as those in New York City. Agricultural regions of Russia constructed psychiatric institutions on the same scale as St. Petersburg. Small towns in the American Midwest, places with populations of 12,000 or 15,000, erected buildings designed to hold 1,500 patients. Where were those patients coming from? The Western State Hospital in West Virginia, opened in 1864, was designed for 250 patients. Within 3 years, it held over 700. The building sat in a region with minimal industrial development, sparse population, and no documented epidemic of mental illness. 700 patients from where? The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, also in West Virginia, was built to accommodate 250. By 1880, it housed 717. By 1938, over 2,400. These weren't cities. These were rural areas, farming communities, small towns. The math doesn't work unless patients were being brought from elsewhere, or unless something created a sudden, massive, geographically dispersed need for psychiatric institutionalization. Something that happened all at once. Something that affected people across continents. Something that required immediate, coordinated containment. Now look at the buildings themselves. These weren't modest medical facilities. They were monuments, stone fortresses built with architectural sophistication that seems inconsistent with their stated purpose, housing the indigent mentally ill. The Kirkbride Plan, introduced by Dr. Thomas Story. Kirkbride in 1854 became the template. massive batwing layouts, central administrative sections with symmetrical residential wings extending hundreds of feet in both directions, built of stone, brick, iron, and glass with precision that rivals government buildings and cathedrals. The Athens Lunatic Asylum in Ohio, the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, the Willard Asylum in New York, the Buffalo State Asylum, St. Elizabeth's in Washington, D.C. Look at photographs of these structures, really look at them. Ornate stonework, soaring towers, arched windows with decorative masonry, ventilation systems more advanced than most hospitals of the period, heating infrastructure requiring engineering expertise supposedly unavailable in remote locations. These buildings cost fortunes. The Danvers State Hospital cost over $1.5 million to construct in 1878. Adjusted for inflation, that's approximately $40 million today. For a psychiatric hospital in a town of 15,000 people. Who authorized that expenditure? Who funded it? And most critically, why build on such a scale before the need existed? Because here's the pattern that keeps repeating. These institutions open with patient populations already in place, not gradually filling over years as local cases accumulated, filled immediately as if the patients were waiting, as if they'd been collected from somewhere else and delivered in bulk. The Utica State Hospital in New York opened in 1843, designed for 550 patients. It admitted 517 patients in its first 6 months of operation. From where? The records don't specify, just transfers from county facilities and commitments from various townships. No names, no detailed case histories, just numbers. And the legal changes happened simultaneously. Britain passed the Lunacy Act in 1845, mandating the construction of county asylums and establishing criteria for involuntary commitment. France enacted near-identical legislation the same year, not similar, nearly word for word, identical in structure and purpose. Between 1845 and 1860, virtually every US state passed commitment laws using remarkably similar language. The criteria for institutionalization expanded dramatically. Before 1840, commitment required obvious, severe impairment. After 1850, almost anything qualified. Moral insanity, behavior that violated social norms but showed no clear cognitive impairment. Monomania, obsessive focus on a single topic. Melancholia, persistent sadness. Nostalgia, homesickness. Religious enthusiasm, excessive piety. These became medical diagnoses justifying permanent institutionalization. And here's what makes it stranger. The same diagnostic categories appeared in asylum records across countries with different medical traditions, different languages, different legal systems. A patient in Massachusetts diagnosed with temporal disorientation and architectural delusion in 1863. A patient in Prussia diagnosed with chronological confusion and structural hallucination in 1864. A patient in France committed for false historical memory and urban distortion syndrome in 1865. Different languages, same symptoms, same timing. Let me read you actual diagnostic descriptions from asylum admission records. Massachusetts, 1859. Patient insists the State House once stood on level ground. Claims current basement was the main entrance. Refuses correction. New York, 1862. Subject maintains buildings on Broadway are partially buried, describes streets as having risen, will not accept logical explanation. Ohio, 1867. Individual exhibits fixed delusion regarding architectural changes in Cincinnati. Claims first-floor shops are now below street level. Argumentative when presented with evidence to contrary. London, 1871. Patient describes impossible architectural configurations. Insists certain structures were taller. Claims to remember different street levels. Unresponsive to treatment. These aren't descriptions of hallucinations. These are descriptions of testimony. Testimony about something specific. About the ground level changing. About buildings being buried. About streets rising. About the mudflood. Because here's what makes this impossible to dismiss. The architectural evidence supports what these patients were saying. St. Petersburg, Paris, London, Boston, San Francisco, Edinburgh, Prague, Istanbul, Buenos Aires, Melbourne. Cities across the globe showing the same anomaly. First-floor windows now underground. doors that open to compacted earth, basement levels with ceiling heights and architectural details inconsistent with below-ground construction. In Boston's Beacon Hill, you can see it today. Buildings with ornate windows 6 feet below street level, not basement windows, too decorative, too large, positioned where main floor windows would naturally sit. In Edinburgh's Old Town, entire ground floors are buried. What's now the basement was clearly designed as the main entrance level. The proportions are wrong for cellar space. The stonework is too refined. San Francisco's oldest neighborhoods show the same pattern, buildings sitting lower than the street. First floors accessed by descending steps, windows that once faced pedestrians now facing soil. The official explanation: gradual urban development. Streets were raised to improve drainage, to accommodate sewer systems, to level terrain for horse carriages and later automobiles. But that process should be documented. There should be engineering reports, city council debates, construction timelines, photographs of the work in progress. There aren't. The streets just are higher. The buildings just are buried. And anyone who questioned it loudly enough, persistently enough, insistently enough to disrupt the new narrative, they were committed. Now trace where the asylum patients came from. The records are deliberately vague. Transient individual of no fixed address. Vagrant found wandering. Subject without settlement or family connection. Person of unknown origin. Over and over in admission logs from the 1850s through 1880s, patients with no documented history before institutionalization. No birth records, no property ownership, no marriage certificates, no employment history, just sudden appearance in the asylum system with a diagnosis and a vague geographic origin. The Athens Lunatic Asylum in Ohio admitted 1,800 patients between 1874 and 1893. Of those, over 600 have admission records listing origin unknown or no established residence. 600 people, no past, no families claiming them, no communities reporting them missing. Where did they come from? And why do so many of their diagnostic descriptions include references to historical confusion, architectural delusions, and memory discrepancies? Let me show you the timeline again, but this time with more detail. 1845. Britain passes comprehensive asylum legislation. 1845. France passes nearly identical asylum legislation. 1846. Prussia mandates provincial asylum construction. 1847-1850. 15 US states pass commitment laws. 1850. Austria begins systematic asylum expansion. 1852. Russia initiates empire-wide psychiatric institutionalization. 1854. The Kirkbride Plan is published and immediately adopted across North America. 1860s. Japan begins constructing Western-style asylums despite no prior psychiatric tradition. 1870s. Argentina, Australia, and South Africa all launch major asylum construction programs. This isn't gradual spread of medical knowledge. This is coordinated implementation. There's no International Psychiatric Congress in this period. No global health organization mandating standards, no documented mechanism for this level of synchronization. Yet the buildings are identical, the laws are identical, the diagnostic criteria are identical, the timing is identical, as if someone, somewhere, knew this infrastructure would be needed, all at once, everywhere. And then the records started vanishing. When asylums closed throughout the 20th century, patient files should have been archived, preserved for historical research, transferred to state repositories or university collections. Instead, they were destroyed. The Danvers State Hospital closed in 1992. Its patient records from 1878 to 1895 gone. Lost in storage relocation. The Athens Lunatic Asylum's admission logs from 1874 to 1893 incomplete. Water damage from roof leak destroyed significant portions. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum's earliest records, disposed of during facility reorganization in 1968. This pattern repeats across institutions. The earliest records, the ones from the peak asylum boom period of 1845-1890, are consistently missing, damaged, or inaccessible. Not random loss, systematic elimination. In 2003, a historian named Dr. Patricia Morrison attempted to access 19th century patient records from 12 major psychiatric institutions across the Northeast. She was researching commitment patterns in Irish immigrants. Of the 12 institutions, 9 had no records available from before 1890. 2 had partial records with entire decades missing. 1 provided access but required signing a non-disclosure agreement about patient identities for people who had been dead for over a century. Why? What's in those records that requires continued suppression 150 years later? Here's where it gets even stranger. Many of the asylums themselves show evidence of the same burial phenomenon they were supposedly built to suppress testimony about. The Western State Hospital in West Virginia examined photographs of its foundation. The lowest windows are partially below ground. The entrance level sits higher than the foundation suggests it should. The Danvers State Hospital, the basement level, has architectural details inconsistent with below-ground construction, high ceilings, decorative stonework, natural light access that requires the ground level to have been lower when built. The Buffalo State Asylum, its foundation shows clear evidence of burial. The building appears to sink into the earth, not settling. Burial, as if constructed on one ground level, then partially submerged by rising terrain. These institutions weren't just built to contain witnesses, they were built using the same architecture, possibly by the same builders, from the same period as the structures they were meant to make people forget. It's as if the asylums themselves are evidence of what they were built to suppress. A few patient writings survived, fragments, diary entries that somehow escaped destruction. From the diary of James Whitmore, committed to Bloomingdale Asylum, New York, 1876. They tell me I am mad. They say my memories are false. But I remember when this building stood on level ground. I remember when the streets of Manhattan were lower. I remember when the harbour was different. They say these are delusions, but I see others here who remember too. We whisper about it at night. We're not mad, we're witnesses, and that's why they'll never let us leave. From a letter by Catherine O'Brien, institutionalized at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Washington, D.C., 1881, letter confiscated, never sent. Mother, I'm not insane. I know what I saw. The city changed, the ground rose. Buildings that once stood tall are now half buried. I've tried to tell them, but questioning is proof of madness here. Others remember too. But we've learned silence. Better to be quiet than to be correct. These weren't hallucinations. These were observations. Accurate observations about architectural anomalies visible today. But in the 1870s, making those observations could cost you your freedom forever. The asylum boom ended as abruptly as it began. By 1910, new construction essentially stopped. The diagnostic criteria that had expanded so dramatically began contracting. Commitment became harder. Patient populations stabilized, then slowly declined. But the buildings remained, and the records from the peak years remained missing. Throughout the 20th century, as these massive institutions closed and were abandoned, there was a consistent pattern. Demolition or adaptive reuse happened quickly, often within months of closure. And always, the records were destroyed first. The Danvers State Hospital was demolished in 2006. Before demolition began, all remaining archival material was removed. Officially, it was transferred to state archives. Researchers attempting to access it have been unable to locate it. The Buffalo State Asylum closed in 1974. Within 6 months, the building was stripped and partially demolished. Patient records were disposed of in accordance with state medical privacy regulations that didn't exist when those patients were alive. The Athens Lunatic Asylum now operates as an art museum, beautiful adaptive reuse, but the patient records? Unfortunately lost prior to the building's transfer to new ownership. It's not conspiracy when the pattern is this consistent, it's policy. Someone, at some institutional level, has decided these records cannot be preserved, these testimonies cannot be examined, these witnesses cannot speak, even a century after their deaths. When you assemble everything, the synchronous global construction, the identical architecture, the coordinated legal frameworks, the diagnostic criteria specifically targeting historical memory, the patient populations appearing from nowhere, the systematic destruction of records, you're left with an unavoidable conclusion. The asylums weren't built to treat mental illness. They were built to disappear witnesses. Witnesses to what? To the event we call the Mudflood. To whatever catastrophic process caused cities across the globe to be partially buried, to the ground level rising 6 to 15 feet in a short enough time frame that people remembered what came before. This wasn't gradual urban development, it was sudden, traumatic, civilization-altering. And the survivors who remembered were inconvenient. You can't rewrite history when witnesses are alive to contradict the new narrative. You can't establish a new timeline when people remember the old one. You can't bury the physical evidence when observers are pointing to it and asking questions. So you medicalize their testimony, you pathologize their memory, you turn truth into symptom. You diagnose architectural observation as delusion. You classify historical memory as temporal disorientation. You institutionalize anyone who won't accept the revised narrative. And you do it globally, simultaneously, using identical infrastructure and identical legal mechanisms. Because this wasn't a local problem, it was worldwide. Whatever buried those first floors didn't respect national borders. The response couldn't either. I can't tell you exactly what happened. I can't give you a definitive timeline of the Mudflood event itself. But I can show you the response. The 500 plus institutions constructed in 40 years. The millions of dollars spent. The coordinated legal frameworks. The diagnostic criteria that criminalized memory. I can show you the patient records that describe exactly what we can still see today. Buildings partially buried, streets impossibly high, architectural evidence of a world that was physically different. And I can show you the systematic destruction of those records, the missing admission logs, the lost patient testimonies, the archives that vanished before independent researchers could examine them. Someone built those asylums knowing they would be needed. Someone expanded commitment criteria to capture people whose only illness was accurate observation. Someone ensured those witnesses would spend their lives behind stone walls, their testimony dismissed as madness. And someone is still ensuring those records remain inaccessible 150 years later. Sarah Mitchell died in Danvers State Hospital in 1891. She was 58 years old. She'd spent 24 years institutionalized. Her diagnosis never changed. Persistent delusions regarding architectural alteration. Her crime was memory. Her punishment was erasure. How many others? How many thousands of witnesses committed, medicated, isolated, and ultimately forgotten because they remembered a world that the official narrative insists never existed? The asylums are mostly gone now, demolished, repurposed, abandoned to decay. But the buried first floors remain. The evidence Sarah Mitchell saw is still there. Still visible, still unexplained. Look at your own city. Find the oldest buildings, notice the windows below street level, the doors that open to earth, the basement levels with architectural details too refined for underground spaces. Then ask yourself, what happened? When did it happen? And who decided that remembering it was a symptom of madness? The witnesses are gone, but the evidence remains. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The ground rose. The buildings were buried, and anyone who said so out loud was disappeared into stone fortresses and diagnosed as insane. That's not medical history, that's suppression. And it worked. For 150 years it worked. Until now.